Clint Murchison Sr. was one of the wealthiest men in Texas. He was an old-time wildcatter. And he and Sid Richardson had bought the license to run a famous racetrack in California called Del Mar. J. Edgar Hoover spent each August at their racetrack in their box and as their guest in their suite at the hotel there.
Hoover's own snapshots hinted how Murchison, too, indulged Hoover's taste for a one-way bet.
He invested in oil wells, and if the oil well went dry, he got his money back. Before he purchased stock, he wanted to know what the inside information was. He got it, then purchased stock, which is all illegal for any citizen.
And old man Murchison told me that the most important person in the world to be close to was the sheriff, and he owned a piece of Mr. Hoover because he felt by making certain that he had the box on the finish line, paying his hotel bills and his food bills, that he owned a piece of Hoover. No doubt about it. He was immune practically from any federal investigation of any of his activities.
And was Hoover's attitude toward organized crime influenced by the generosity of a Murchison or a Rosenstiel? One day, the gangster Meyer Lansky spoke about his virtual immunity from the FBI.
He says, if you'll note, he says he doesn't go after anybody like Santo, myself, Carlos in Louisiana. He says he doesn't touch any of us.
Santos Traficante was the mafia chieftain in Tampa. Carlos Marcello was the godfather of New Orleans.
And I said, you mean to tell me that you pay off Hoover? And he said, absolutely not. He wouldn't take a penny in front, especially from a guy like me. And he laughed. I said, well, how do you do it? He says, I know at least a half a dozen of his friends that are friends of mine. And he went like this to show like quotes. He says, and they take pretty good care of me.
But Hoover's gambling and his dubious friendships never tarnished his image.
This testimony does not stand alone. I talked to a former regular officer in the OSS, that's the predecessor of the CIA, who said that after the war, he went to dinner with other OSS American intelligence colleagues, and that after dinner, when over the brandy stage, when conversation turned to the private lives of public people, his host went out of the room and then came back with a photograph. And this was passed around the table, and the photograph showed two men, Hoover and Tolson, engaged in homosexual activity.
In New Orleans, where the CIA and the Mafia had sometimes collaborated, Mafia Don Carlos Marcello told Gordon Novell that he, too, had seen a photograph.
I had volunteered the information that I had seen a picture of Mr. Hoover in performing oral sex, and he said that he had seen it, too, and that had been used to keep the FBI, but not the Justice Department, off the back of the mob.
Meyer Lansky had some pretty heavy stuff on Hoover, that he was a homosexual, without any question. And he'd shove it to him if he ever had to.
Irving Resnick said Lansky was the guy who controlled the pictures, and he had made his deal with Hoover to lay off. That was the reason that for a long time we had nothing to fear from the FBI.
In the 40s, we hardly touched organized crime because the Bureau did not believe that there was a mafia or did not allow us to investigate the mafia as such.
For the vital decades of the Mafia's growth, Hoover denied that nationally syndicated organized crime existed and ignored all evidence that it did.
There wasn't one mention of the Mafia. There wasn't one mention of organized crime activities during the training course that I and all other brand new FBI agents went through in Washington. Not one mention of it.
In fact, the Bureau in Washington had no organized crime division. When I went to the supervisor in Seattle and asked why we weren't going after the mafia, he said, "We don't use that word. Hoover doesn't acknowledge that there's a mafia."